Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in the follow-up webinar as part of our CADRE Learning Series on professional development for people who don't study professional development. In between the last webinar and the current one, we have had consultations. Each of us did 2 or more consultations with different investigators who are wanting to improve their professional development design. So in this webinar, we are going to be sharing some of the dilemmas and issues that came up during our consultation, with the assumption that other folks probably have similar dilemmas. I think that there's a little bit of a hidden message, a tacit message to this sharing as well, which is kind of uncovering just how complex this work is, because I think we all encountered questions and issues that came up that don't exactly have answers. So hopefully by normalizing some of that, we can just sort of have a better conversation as a field about what it takes to do professional development and the kinds of issues that you can probably expect to encounter in this work. Just as a quick reminder, I'm going to share my screen real quick to, assuming I can find the right slide, to just share what we learned in what we kind of came to. Why is this not showing up in my share slide? Okay, let me try this again. I wanted to share the design principles we ended with in the last meeting, just to as a quick reminder. This was what we came to. I don't expect you to read this all, but in our presentations in the last webinar, we came up with a list of design principles that are things that we think about as we design PD for our own projects. And so we use this as sort of a launching point for our consultations. So if you want to take a screen grab of that, go ahead. It's also in the video of the last webinar. And honestly, part of our reflections today is going to be about some of the limitations of these and some of the dilemmas that these things don't address. So without further ado, oh, and one other thing just about format, because we're a smaller group this time, we have fewer participants, we're hoping to be able to have more of a discussion. So the format of this is going to be, we're each going to do a little presentation about our consultations and some of the issues that came up, and then have about 5 minutes of dialogue with the panelists, and even considering some of y'all's questions, if you have things you want to ask about as well. And hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some cross-cutting questions that came up. So I'm going to start with, let's see, my consultation. Let me get my screen shared. Last time I had 2 screens, and this time I have 1, and I've learned I am not as good at maneuvering on a webinar with 1 screen instead of 2. So I had a consultation with an investigator who wanted to help teachers understand the idea of universal design for learning. And they're already doing a lot of professional development work as a part of their research, but their worry was that it was boring, and they wanted to make sure it was more engaging to teachers. They're very clear about what their learning goal is for teachers, which is this idea that disability is contextual, shifting, and complex. So we have an investigator doing PD, wanting to make sure it's engaging with teachers and it's making contact with their practice with a very, very clear end goal in mind. They were working on a design of getting teachers to work in teams, school-based teams that involved both special ed folks, content specialists, and so on, to identify something to design or redesign in their school site using universal design for learning. But their question that they brought to the consultation was, how do I study this? Now, I think this is something that happens a lot, is that folks are doing work, they're doing PD, they realize that there's interesting things going on. And even though their work is not necessarily teacher learning or teacher PD, they think, gosh, I kind of want to study this intervention. So it's a tricky thing to pivot to, but because people who are trained in traditional quantitative, qualitative methods may not have the tools to pivot to studying this kind of work. So what I recommended was that they use design-based intervention research to study what they were doing just by instinct. And the idea of design-based intervention research is to really focus on the relationship between designs and learning. And that I encourage them to ask questions like, of their team, like, why did we include this component? For example, why did they include the component of having teachers work in school-based teams? Why did they have the special ed teachers working with a content specialist? Like, what is the underlying thinking behind that? Because that can start to uncover a theory of learning that is underlying this design. Then, because they were so clear on their particular learning goal, I asked them to see if their team could specify what would they take as evidence that teachers learned UDL ideas. Like, what would they look for as designers of this PD intervention to say, aha, yes, they really do understand UDL. And this is a process called conjecture mapping. So part of what I did in my consultation was I shared some references and resources about design-based research with the investigator. The first one is a piece by Bill Sandoval about just the process of conjecture mapping and how you go about doing it. The next two are some kind of foundational pieces, but they kind of operate on different scales. So Chris Gutierrez and Susan Giroux's piece on social design experiments is more about focused on collaborating with communities to identify design goals together, particularly in the pursuit of equity and justice. The other one by Cobb and colleagues is more about design experiments in general. So you can see it's an older piece than the more recent one by Gutierrez and Giroux, but it sort of gives an overview of the field. They're both very accessible pieces, so I pointed the investigator to that. And if you are looking at like larger scales, this is a lot, I know Jessica does a lot of work sort of on this scale. I also pointed them to the National Network of Research Practice Partnerships, which is more about when institutions or researchers collaborate with like at more at an institutional level as research practice partnerships. So that is what I have for my consultation presentation. And I am really eager to chat with my colleagues and with you all about these issues. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share now. Hopefully you got these citations if you needed them. So colleagues, did you have anything like that come up in your consultations, or would you add anything to what I offered this investigator in terms of thinking about pivoting to researching PD?
So Lonnie, I think the idea of trying to figure out the theory of learning that underlies professional development is really hard work. And I think people design professional development not with an implicit theory of learning, but that in order to study it, I think you do have to intentionally work to try to articulate for yourself and then for others what the theory of learning is.
And there's multiple theories of learning. Like there's what's your theory of kid learning, what's your theory of teacher learning, what's your theory of network learning, there's multiple theories that you can ask about that influence how teachers learn too.
Right. And I think sometimes the most basic and least, I would say, least rich version of teacher learning is that the teachers are conforming or complying with the practices that I'm trying to get them to do, which it's almost like an imitative idea rather than a sense-making idea.
It almost seems more like evaluation research to me. Like, did you learn the thing that we hoped you would learn? Which is a very different question than what's the experience of the participants. And so I think they're more of an evaluation kind of question and more of a research kind of question.
So how do you all break out of that? Because this language of compliance and like fidelity of implementation and so much is so pervasive when it comes to teachers. We often treat teachers like cogs in a system rather than as sense makers. So do you all have some strategies for better focusing on their learning and sense making rather than their compliance with your preordained ideas about what the classroom should look like?
I think this is really a lovely question and a question we wrestle with at multiple levels too within the any professional learning setting, be it with teachers or with our students too. And it's making me wonder about this idea of flexibility and openness and adaptability. How willing are we to be responsive to the needs and goals and hopes and desires that learners bring to the table? And learners meaning it could be teachers, could be K-12 learners, especially when those may not resonate with our own hopes or goals or orientations, you know? So I'm maybe extending the question to say, like, in moments where there are tensions in what the hopes are for us from this work, what the hopes are for the learners that we are working with. So yeah, I think that this idea of responsiveness is tricky, right? Like responsiveness with respect to what and in service of what, I think is an important question to ask as well.
I see that Amy wrote a question in the chat. Amy Hackenberg from Indiana University, Bloomington. Welcome, Amy. She asks, what are resources about adult teacher learning that you all find useful? I mean, I'm the worst self-promoter. I do it out of necessity, but honestly, that was the question we were pursuing in the book that we just published, is really trying to get a handle on teacher learning and to distinguish it from, like Jessica was saying, you need different theories for what you're expecting in classrooms, what you're expecting of teachers, and what you're expecting of systems. Those operate under different conditions. So we were really trying to focus in on that one. In our book is called Teacher Learning of Ambitious and Equitable Mathematics Instruction. So you can check that out. We reviewed a lot of literature as we were writing that book. So what I found is that there's kind of bits and pieces out there. One of my favorite pieces is also a piece that Jessica wrote about pre-service teachers learning and following them into in-service. Tell me the title of that piece, Jessica. I love that one.
Was that the Problems Without Ceilings, or was that the one in ARJ?
ARJ one.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was towards a theory of ambitious teaching. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that one. Just because I find it's a good example for me of really looking at what is evidence and how do you honor what the participant sense making. And I think part of what you see when you look at people who do take that work very seriously is it's really hard to do. It requires a different kind of attention, and when you really center that. How are we on time? Okay. Do we have time for like one more question maybe? or comment from? Oh, 10 minutes. Okay, good. So we have, let's see. Do we have more questions? Okay. Panelists, do you want to add anything or should we? Okay, well, Carrie said that she brings up some of this in her presentation and she is next, our next presenter. So I am going to turn the floor over to her.
Okay, let's see. Am I unmuted? I am unmuted. Right? Okay, so I'm gonna just speak briefly because this was brought up, kind of some additional thoughts I've had, and then I'm gonna invite Janice to speak with me kind of in a conversation. She's here on the call with us and we did our consultation. But one of the things, this is kind of like an overview, and then I'm going to zoom in, is that we talked about is, teachers' goals may be different than researchers' goals. So for instance, in my NSF career project right now, I have a teacher who really wants to focus on complex instruction. And so that's what I'm supporting him on. I'm supporting him on CI work. I did my student teaching at the Railside School. Lani and I, connected over this a while back. So I have a background in CI and I've been supporting him on that because that's what he wants to focus on, even though it's not the primary focus of my project, which is about social justice mathematics. That's what I've decided. I still have to speak to my program officer, but I'm hoping that that's going to be, a pivot for now, and then, to come back to the social justice mathematics. One of the other things that has happened since our last meeting was that I did a whole school PD, and one of the social studies teachers that I co-facilitated with is he wanted to make sure that we asked this question around, and we were talking about social justice pedagogy, and he wanted to ask this question, like, what are teachers already doing in their practice, right? So teachers were already doing these in their own classrooms. And then I'm going to skip to this one about how do we position teachers as experts to highlight their strengths, both for research purposes as well as for themselves and with their colleagues. So one of the things that I'm doing is lesson study, and I'm using this kind of strengths-based approach. But okay, so I want to shift to my discussion with Janice. Sorry, and also like using healing informed and social justice approaches. So let me go to this slide. Janice, I was told to make this, I don't know, de-identify. So I called your project PD to support culturally relevant instruction of computational thinking. And one of the things that we first talked about, so Janice and her team, Man and Francesca, shared with me a PD observation tool where the research team is going to be taking field notes of the PD as it's happening. So one of the exciting things about my discussion with Janice and Man, and Francesca couldn't make it, is that we're all women of color researchers. And I'll speak to some other tensions about that. But one of the things that we talked about was being transparent. I suggested like being transparent with teachers to tell them what the notes are, that the research team is taking so that teachers are comfortable. And then to co-develop the themes with the teachers. So the research team shares like, these are some of the things that we noticed, let's collaborate on this and think about this together. So I want to invite Janice to say hi and share your thoughts.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I think that was, hi, Carrie. I think that was where our conversation started, and I think it really goes to that participatory approach and some of what you all have been sharing about just really co-designing, and I think that space and building that community together. So teachers, it's not something being done to them. It's really, we're partners in this, and I think it sends a very different message. And so I think posing that question and Carrie posed it from the sense of like the teacher's perspective, like, wait, are they going to be, and that was really as we're designing these instruments, it just really helps to have, it just makes me realize we just need this larger community. We need a lot of collaboration in this field to move our practice forward and our thinking forward. So.
Thanks, Janice. And then the other thing that their team shared with me was their culturally responsive teaching tool. And so I kind of just picked out some of the bullets that we talked about. One of the bullets was, is this lesson one that would be relevant to my students based on what I know about their experiences and backgrounds? Does my way of communication differ from that of my students and their families? How am I sharing my own personal experiences with students and modeling how students respect and honor those experiences? So for the first one, I mean, we talked about like, how would a teacher know if it is culturally relevant to their students, right? And same thing with the second one, does my way of communication differ from that of my students and their families? Like, how would you know, right? And so we talked also about stereotypes of Asian American families, right? I don't know, Janet, I don't know if you felt comfortable sharing. You don't have to share your story, Janice, if you don't want to.
I don't mind, I can. So my first teaching job in Arizona, I was hired over the phone. So the principal never saw my face, but she liked me from the interview and from my resume. And then when she met me, I didn't know this, but my colleague in the room next to me said, "Oh my gosh, Janice, did you hear what the principal, do you know what the principal said to me?" I said, "What?" She said, "Oh, I don't know. I don't know about Asian Americans and their classroom management skills." And so it was kind of, and so they were in my classroom all the time, just like watching me. And I'm like, this is a different place. I wonder why they're in my classroom all the time watching me, watching my every move. And I had no idea. I was clueless. I was like, oh, they just must be into that at this school. And it wasn't until after the first benchmark testing that the principal and the assistant principal called me into the office. And I was like, okay, I thought I was in trouble. And then they sat me down and they were like, "Janice, we don't know what you're doing, but your scores are like beyond, whatever." And the assistant principal, who was in my classroom a lot, said, as she was, observing me, she said, "Oh, and I thought I caught you one day." She said, "I thought you were going to turn your back on the class, but you, faced the kids the whole time as you were moving them into small groups." And I was like, and it wasn't until I didn't even like respond, or I guess I was just shocked. But I think afterwards, now I'm like, as an observer, I realized like, what you go in looking for, like they went in with that bias. And so they were looking for me to mess up. And so it's just a real reminder. And I think this conversation with Carrie really caused me to reflect now the role that I'm in, like how critical it is to really reflect and be careful. So.
So we had just a really interesting, conversation with like 3 Asian American women, right? Talking about our experiences. And I think it's interesting too, in some of my other work with my graduate students, working with white teachers, like the microaggressions that we get as researchers. So it's a little bit, I think, of the flip of kind of some of the issues that Jessica, the important, things to notice that Jessica brought up last time that I think is like interesting and worth exploring. I did also think that this one is kind of interesting too, Janice, like, how much do we want teachers to share if they're from the dominant perspective? But I did also want to share with folks, I'm sure people are familiar with this article by Rich Milner. He has these 4 different areas and, using CRT as a framework of, really valuing the knowledge and experiences of people of color. And he has these different questions. I just took out a couple of bullets for each of the 4, but one of the things he always adds on is like, how do we know, right? Like, how do we even know these things? But I think that this is a really great article for us to think about, both as researchers and as PD, doing PD as part of our research. Let's see, Janice, do you have any final words?
No, I just think my only comment was I was chatting Carrie. I'm like, wow, you're really living this participatory design. Even in your webinars, you're asking me to share the space with you. So I'll just end with that. I think I think the closing message is like who we are and what we are comes through in everything we do and say. So appreciate it. Thank you for the mentoring.
I really appreciated the point that you both brought up around communicating with teachers when we're in their classrooms and being transparent about what we're looking for and what our goals are. And your story, Janice, which is deeply upsetting and really gross, reminds us that especially teachers from marginalized groups may have experiences of being observed that are pretty hostile. And so just because we feel like we have good intentions doesn't mean we're going to be experienced that way. And we have to remember that transparency and communication and relationality and all of that stuff matters when we're working with teachers too, and that classrooms are really unpredictable spaces, right? There's so much that happens that is outside of our realm of observation, that's outside of our control. And yet we have evaluation systems that attribute everything that goes on to the teacher as if the teacher is like hyperagentic in those spaces. And so being really transparent, I would add normalizing that classrooms are unpredictable and trying to distinguish yourself from those evaluative frames that teachers experience is also like a really important part if classroom observation is a part of your PD. Thank you for that. That was awesome. Other panelists want to weigh in on what Carrie and Janice shared?
You know, this is making me reflect back on this idea you raised question around Lenny, you raised the question about like evaluation versus learning, and how much sometimes with a good intention of wanting to do good work, right, and abiding by particular observation protocols, or moving towards goals that we have promised NSF or other funding agencies that this is the objective that I want to hold true to. Within this good intention, there could be some harmful implication if we are not open to being flexible to adjust, well, one, to be transparent about where our positionality and our goals and intention, but also to be flexible if our goals and intentions do not match up well with the teachers we have the privilege to work with, then like being open to that negotiation. I appreciate so much, Carrie, how you reflected on your own career project, making the choice to put on hold your own interest in working around the social justice math teaching, so that you can take on for a moment your the teachers you're working with, their own goals and needs. So this is just fantastic.
Ruth, I'm looking at you hoping that you'll step in, because a lot of your work at TDG involves being in teachers' classrooms, and you must have like a bunch of tools about how to lay the groundwork so that it's about learning and not evaluation.
Yeah, which actually might lead into what I'm going to talk about. But, I think we really try to both understand and begin with where teachers are. Even though we have like a program of professional development, it's really designed in a way where it's built around what teachers are currently doing and what their agenda is. And it requires really skilled facilitators to both have an agenda in mind, but being flexible in the moment to alter, to be responsive in ways people are talking about here. And then I think that gets even more complicated in the context of a research project. So there's doing professional development,
Yep.
and then there's doing professional development for the purpose of research. And I think those things are very different and they raise different tensions.
Yeah, I think that's actually, Carrie, I appreciate about what you shared too, that you modeled for us how you act responsively to a teacher, right? Like, so you have your career grant, you set up one agenda, you go and work with a teacher. The teacher says, actually, I want to do this other thing. So you're telling us there's a way to do that within this system of grant writing and funding and so on, which is to go back to the program officer. And if your commitments are clear up front that you're going to be responsive to the teacher, then you already have kind of like a little backdoor way of saying, hey, I got to change my focus because this is what the teacher wants and needs. So I thank you for sharing that part of your story too. I agree, Ruth. Let's shift to you next and what you're going to share, and we can have some more conversation about these issues.
Let me see. Okay, so I wanted to start with the dilemma. Oops. Oh, I don't know why it's not. Oh, okay. So here is the dilemma I started with and my design principle. And quickly, I don't know why this isn't changing. Oh, quickly, I agree with the design principle, and as soon as I started talking about it, and actually as I listened to my colleagues in the last webinar, I already wanted to revise how I was thinking about it. So I just mentioned this, that I think a first caveat is thinking about what it means to be a practitioner providing professional development and contrasting that to a researcher designing professional development to study it. So in the context of being a practitioner providing PD, which so I'm not a university faculty member. I run a nonprofit who provides PD, but also has research projects within it. When I think just about the PD, I take a strengths-based approach, working to meet learners where they are, and we work with all learners. So if it's only in the context of thinking about research that I would even suggest a design principle where you would choose teachers who are already learners. We work with teachers, students, administrators, wherever they are. And ideally, we want to work with them over multiple years. Everyone here knows learning takes time. I think very differently about it as a researcher providing PD. Again, I take a strengths-based approach, meet learners where they are, but there are many considerations to contemplate as you think about who the participants are going to be. And so when I think about this initial design principle, these are things I was thinking about. My own research trajectory, research questions I've thought about, my context, my understanding of teacher learning, and a strategy for building a program of research over time, which in my experience has been start small and scale up. And some of these ideas became much clearer to me as I talked with a group of 2 new researchers They've submitted a proposal. It's an exploratory project in the teaching strand. They've applied for level 1 of funding, so a relatively small project, 3 years, $450,000. And what they're doing is trying to understand the potential of an existing innovation in the field of math ed that's used widely, but really lacks a research base. And what they're trying to explore is the potential for developing a research base around this existing innovation and try to understand the degree to which it can both support mathematical reasoning and students' identity and agency. So in the context of this project, they have designed 1 year of professional development. They want to recruit 25 teachers across 2 sites, and they're contemplating, do they recruit individual teachers, a grade level team, a whole school? In my conversation with them, we recognized that there are a whole host of considerations and affordances and limitations to think about. So what is it that you're trying to learn? Who are you trying to learn from and with? Are there particular demographics of the participants that matter to your study and to your research questions? What role does professional development play in your study? Are you studying the PD, or is the PD serving a purpose to study something else? What is it that you want participants to learn? What are you trying to learn? What's the scope and duration of your project? How much money do you have, which is another way to think about scope? How long are you planning to provide professional development? Do you study participants who have experience with the innovation or not? There are affordances and limitations of both things. Do you recruit from a school or a district? The people that I was talking to, they talked about the pros and cons of knowing the teachers that they might work with versus choosing teachers at random. So is it people you know? Do you want to choose participants? What are the criteria that you want to use? Do you want to use volunteers? Do you want student or participants who apply? Do you want others to help you choose? What's the best case scenario in terms of participants? What's the worst case scenario? And so I think both for myself and for the people that I talk to, it quickly gets overwhelming if you really take seriously all of the things you need to take into consideration and start weighing the trade-offs and the affordances. With this particular consultation, they're at the very beginning of their research, both in their careers and with this idea. And so they really are at the point of starting small. And we talked both about what this project might look like, but also what their longer research trajectory might look like as beginning researchers. So I think I thought about this in the context of the various kinds of projects that NSF offers that you can write proposals for. And again, depending on what you choose, where you place your research, depends on where you are both in your personal research trajectory, but also where you are in thinking about the ideas that you're trying to study. Another thing to consider, and again, I thought about this in the context of the opportunities offered by NSF. It depends on how much money you have, how many participants you're thinking about, how long you might be able to work together with these participants. So as I think now about a design principle for resolving the dilemma of who the participants should be, I try to tease apart, am I thinking about it as a practitioner, as a researcher? Am I thinking about it within a single research project, within a larger program of research? And what I suggest now is that you ask yourself many questions because it depends.
I love that. That was super helpful, Ruth. You really kind of dug deep into the distinction between doing PD because you're doing PD as a practitioner versus the research goals kind of add an extra layer of obligation and so on, which I think is an important distinction to name, because I think sometimes we feel these tensions, right? And so it builds nicely off of what Carrie was sharing, because she had that dilemma come up because the teacher wanted one thing and her proposal said something else, just she found a way to resolve it. I'm wondering if other panelists can talk to these design choices about how to honor your research and work as a researcher while also being mindful of the teachers as learners and respecting their agency and where they are as learners and their willingness to engage.
Can jump in. I was just thinking about how, there's a choice about whether you want to do, when you're working with, say, like a school district, if you want to design for like an all-comer design, or if you want to start early with like folks who are ready to jump in. Like there's always that consideration. And especially if you need like a proof of concept in some ways, it's really important to start with the folks who are willing. Like, I always say, if you're eager, I'll take that over experience any day. Like just willingness to partner and try some things out. Sometimes you need to start there to get that sort of imagining what's possible in classrooms and then build out from there.
That proof of concept idea, I think, is really important. It's a really good heuristic to think about as others are making their designs. So Ruth was talking about this idea of starting small and thinking about exploratory work. And some of that exploratory work might be like what Jessica's calling proof of concept, right? That classrooms can be this way. This is not just, some researcher design intervention in some very rarefied place, but somebody who was not involved in the conceptualization of this can transform their classrooms. And part of what sometimes comes out of that for you as a researcher is teachers innovate too, right? This is part of where their agency and their imaginations can be a boon to us as researchers, because they're dealing with the full complexity of their classroom milieu. And so they'll come up with things that we might not have anticipated or imagined, but yet we have the ability to document and share with others. So that can be a really rich way to work. Do others want to share thoughts?
I'll just chime in and say I agree with Jessica. when I facilitated that whole school PD, I found out that a social studies teacher had used one of the social justice math lessons in his classroom, and the learning support teacher of the teacher who really wants to focus on complex instruction was in her group talking about the importance of academically heterogeneous groupings. So that, I was great to see that. But I'm curious, I don't know, Ruth, did you say like what the team that you were consulting with kind of like decided or what they?
So they are waiting to find out if they will have funding.
Oh, I see.
So they've only proposed the idea, and they're realizing that the deciding who the participants are is a lot more complicated than what they initially thought.
Well, thank you from that. We are going to now turn to Lama. He's going to take us deeper into this question of working with teachers.
Hi, everyone. It's amazing how the different talks are building up and the intersecting points across the different things, including with respect to teacher agency, responsiveness, willingness to really flexibly be able to shift goals in ways that serve ultimately the teachers, the learners that we are working with. So my focus will be more on how do we attend to and negotiate and respond with care and respect and in humanizing ways to the affective and relational tensions that emerge when we do this tricky, complex work that we do in teacher and in professional learning settings. So I'll start by sharing my screen and by framing this conversation maybe around, let's see. Around a quote that I used in the first part of the series, when I mentioned this quote by Stein and colleague, who really attend to this idea of teachers who are learning and changing their practice are in a potentially delicate position because they are vulnerable to their peers' opinions, to the professional developers' perceptions, and their administrators' expectations. So I think this kind of positioning that teachers have within the PD can sometimes make them feel vulnerable and may trigger certain emotions of insecurity or anxiety, or sometimes resistance to the ideas being discussed, worries that they may carry with them within the PD itself and into the classrooms. And so for many of the teachers that we work with, those PD learning settings can be threatening experiences and can raise lots of questions about who they are as people, as STEM learners, as teachers. And I think this, in my earlier conversation, kind of led me to think about the importance of designing our professional learning settings with an eye towards learners' affect and the relational dynamics that emerge in PD, especially around issues of also authority and power and status of the participants that we work with. So in light of this kind of framing around some ideas that I was playing with earlier on around attending to affect and relationality, I would like to share some of the questions that came up in the opportunities that I had to exchange some of the ideas with other scholars who are wrestling with these things and thinking deeply and critically about how to best design learning spaces that honor learners' feelings and the relational dynamics. So I'm going to start by sharing some of the questions that came up, and there are many more that we can sit with. And I will say from here, like, we did not really come up with any specific answers, but together we brainstormed some ideas for how we could be more carefully thinking through those questions. So one of the questions was, how can we create spaces that really encourage teachers to openly share their emotions, especially around feelings of insecurity and vulnerability, and to reframe some of these emotions in ways that would best support their learning? And what do we do when certain negative emotions are expressed within PD settings? How can we support teachers to channel their own identities as learners in ways that could help them connect with and make sense of their emotions and where those emotions are coming up for them. How do we design PD with affect in mind, especially in PD that centers issues of racial and other kinds of injustices, and that could, and other educational inequities that typically are fraught with lots of emotions and heightened affect can come up within those conversations? And how do we grapple with and control our own emotions as PD facilitators, especially when there are tensions and contestations where perhaps among participants themselves around epistemological or ideological orientations, and also between the participants and the PD facilitators? And then how can we productively address affective and relational tensions, especially around issues of power and positionality? For example, in groups that are in PD that involves teachers who are more veteran teachers or novice teachers, or across a wide range of expertise and backgrounds. So some of the things that we brainstormed and came up with, I'm going to go over 5 points, and these are not really in any specific order or hierarchy, and they are quite entangled they intersecting, and also connect with a lot of what we've been discussing together in this panel. So the first thing, I think this is particularly important when we think about PD that will trouble and problematize some entrenched assumptions and practices that, or in PD that will center issues that would be difficult to discuss and unpack, including those related to educational injustices, those pertaining to racism and other kinds of isms or injustices in the educational system. So it's important to really, from the onset, set the stage around trust and relationship building. So we discussed this idea of creating opportunities for ourselves and the participants that we're working with to get to know each other as people first. Maybe it's outside of the context of the PD itself, within or outside really, but sometimes it might be helpful to think about ways to create opportunities to get to know each other personally in social events or something that is outside of just knowing each other as teachers or within a particular professional capacity. And here, I think some of what we discussed, I think this notion of transparency that Carrie talked about, to be willing to share our own positionalities and motivations and agenda for the work that we do, so that we come to the table also as transparent as we can, and so that the teachers who decide to work with us know what they're signed up for and get to know that part of us as well. And the second, which is related and also came up around this idea of the goals and the ownership of the learning goals, and who gets to decide, right? Like, what is it that we want to foster in this space that we are in? So this came up when we were reflecting in one of the consultation sessions on a vexing situation where there was a PD, the PD was designed to involve both novice teachers and more veteran teachers, where it seems that the novice teacher have been very interested and excited about what was going on, but the veteran teachers not so much, and many of them decided maybe not to pursue or continue with the PD. And in that PD, the veteran teachers were positioned or given opportunities to provide training for the novice teachers to use certain technologies and to expand their content knowledge within a specific area. So what happened in those cases is veteran teachers, wanted to do that part and be giving I'm quoting here or paraphrasing this idea from an interview that came up with a veteran teacher who said, "I gave what I was supposed to give, so I'm ready to go on to the next thing." So in those cases, we came to understand that perhaps for some of the participating teachers, they were not realizing or they were not experiencing this space as a space or a place for learning for them, but they were more thinking of their role as giving and providing for the novice teachers. So I think this raised the question of how can we continuously gauge and ask teachers, what do you need? What are your goals and aspirations? And is this PD serving and satisfying your needs? And what can we do differently if not? So be willing to adjust the PD goals, as we've been discussing here, to foster relevance for teachers and support their ownership and agency of their learning goals. So this idea of the third point was related to the importance of attending to the epistemological and ideological assumptions and systems that teachers may come into the PD with, and think about those as closely entangled with the ways in which they might be emotionally expressing what is going on within a PD setting. So by epistemology and ideology, broadly speaking, talking about things related to how teachers may be framing a specific learning activity, their value systems, their perceptions and aspirations related to teaching and learning. So in one of the discussion, it became clear that what was at play was less about providing, while we were initially talking about it as providing emotional support for engagement for the teachers, it became clear that what was needed was most explicitly getting into and discussing underlying ideas and conceptions about what it means to teach and what the participation in the PD entailed. So I think sometimes it's important to attend to teachers' emotions in tandem with having explicit conversations about epistemology and ideology with them. And fourth, again, this is related to the point 3, which is that it's important to also be attuned not only to the various range of orientations that teachers may come into the PD with, but also to the positionalities in terms of their level of expertise or experience in the field. It became salient in one of the discussions that, as I mentioned, the veteran teachers and the novice teachers in the group were positioned in really interesting and different ways. While the veteran teachers were seen as more the expert around certain content or their facility with certain technology, and they were training the more novice teachers in those areas, novice teachers were contesting some of the pedagogical approaches and practices that these veteran teachers were enacting. And those novice teachers coming in with more reform-based ideas about pedagogy were challenging some of those practices that veteran teachers are bringing to the table. So these contestations can lead to lots of tension. So one of the things that we discussed is how can we, from the beginning, frame the space as one of learning and growth for everyone included, and less so as about a display of expertise or an offering of expertise. So how can we challenge and disrupt those kind of positionalities or assumptions about our roles in this space? And I will say that also what came up in another conversation is that those negotiations can heighten or can raise feelings for the facilitators themselves. So one question came up is how do we sit with and process the feelings that we experience, especially when there are ideological tensions in the group and ideas or orientations that may not be aligned with our own assumptions as PD facilitators. So how can we also be transparent with participants about these feelings when they come up? I think I'm going to be mindful of my time and skip through this one briefly. It's one idea came up of how can we invite more spaces for teachers' whole selves to come to the table and where they can channel and draw on their own varied identities as resources to make sense of their feelings. But one main takeaway for me, and I'll end with that, but I'm looking forward to the discussion, is, and I'm quoting, this is kind of a takeaway from the different conversation, and I'm quoting here Dr. Maria Varelas, who mentioned that in one of her discussant comments at the NARS conference, that it's important for us all to attend and elevate emotion and affect as inseparable and critical dimensions of our life and practices and of our learning as teachers, and I will add as teacher educators as well, which call for the need to design and create and study places of learning where emotionality is expected, embraced, and processed in productive ways that are both felt and cognized. So thank you so much. I'm excited for the conversation.
That was really powerful, Lama, and it resonated a lot with me in my experience as a PD facilitator. And what I'm enjoying so much about all of these presentations is how much we're kind of surfacing these things that we've kind of learned through the work, that we don't have frameworks for talking about this stuff. Whenever I teach, I've done a lot of professional development on complex instruction. And when I teach about status, I always know that I have to hang out afterwards because someone is going to have kind of an identity crisis. A teacher whose like whole sense of self-worth has been built upon the idea that they're smart at math is going to really be suffering. And I need to be present for that. And I never as something I tell my students, but I don't have a framework for it. And the way that you described making space for affect, it's just something I've learned over time out of necessity, but I haven't had a way to articulate it. So I think that's really, really helpful. And honestly, the way I'm feeling about these webinars is I'm going to make all my students watch the recordings, because there's just such a rich set of insights that are being shared today. So that's me fangirling and thumbs upping a lot of what you shared, but I'd really like to open the floor to the other panelists and questions from the folks watching at home.
I mean, I do have a question around, you know, when we talk about like frameworks or this like checklisty type of, you know, like some of the things that we do are literally, they're just like, they come from this like healing informed, like care-based approach that is how like you live your life. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's a little bit dangerous for us to say, you know, well, if you do this checklist of things, then the teachers, you know, that you're working with, they're going to feel valued and cared for, and they're going to want to work with you, right? I think that things are much deeper and complex than a checklist. So I just wanted to underscore that, and I feel like other folks would probably agree with that.
I totally agree. And I just was looking at Antero Garcia and Ernest Morel have a new book out on play in the classroom. And I was looking at the table of contents, and one of their ideas is authenticity is the standard. And I was just like, yes, exactly. Authenticity is the standard. Like, we have been so polluted with these ideas of these external ideas of what makes good teaching. And it's that connection that you can't checklist. It's that honest dialogue. It's that sometimes hard dialogue that where you're really grappling with things. Okay, Nico, I see your question. It is excellent. I'm going to actually move the baton over to Jessica, and I want to pick up, because of what she's going to be talking about, I want to pick up your question after we listen to Jessica's presentation, because I think she might start to address this. Okay, trying to keep us on time. Jessica, you are up, my friend.
All right, well, we'll have to see, Nico, if I answer this question or not, but I actually wanted to take a slightly different approach. I had the opportunity to have consultations with 3 research groups, and I would like to share a little bit from each one. So a little bit bucking the rules here, but because I thought that the kinds of tensions that everyone's wrestling with are really the same ones that our research group is continually wrestling with. And it was honestly hard for me to just choose one. I think that it's often the things that you don't write about in your publications. Also, it's the real sort of day-to-day. How do you sort of work in and work through a lot of the tensions? And so I'll share with you some of these thoughts. And I've invited both Amy and Kate were in with, and we had conversations together. So feel free to jump in as I go, because I think we were wrestling with a lot of these things together. Okay, slow load. We were really wrestling as an extension from the last time we talked. We were thinking about designing professional learning that centers educational justice in K-12 science and math is what we ended up thinking about, and really naming the tensions as well as working through to see what some of the possibilities are. And from the 3 consultations, I sort of saw 2 dilemmas that I think we, including myself, are wrestling with, which is designing with and for tensions by thoughtfully attending to this concept of rightful presence. And the other, which maybe others will resonate with this also, is designing with districts around professional learning in a time of pushback on critical race theory or even equity quite generally. I shared this last time. This is sort of a set of tensions in teacher learning that I think we bump up against. And I was just reflecting on how, you know, there's no design principle that says live in the tension. But I was really, I think, you know, if you sort of look at like cultural historical activity theory, it says sort of live, you know, if you can make some of these tensions apparent, then you can design for them. Design knowing that they're going to be a part of your project. And so I think it's also helpful to think through where are the tensions so that you can design for the tough conversations with folks. And you won't have it all worked out, but these are some of the ones that we are living in. I think in the consultations with others, we were really wrestling with this idea of defining equity as inclusion and access, but also taking this critical perspective where we're thinking about dimensions of power, politics, rightful presence. They also, I think the tensions really center this idea around, are we working with folks on what we call race neutral teaching practices? Or how are we helping teachers really think about noticing and thinking about what are the race conscious dimensions around practice? So the first dilemma I wanted to highlight is, you know, as we're working, I think designing with and for tensions, how are we attending to rightful presence? So Angie Calabrese-Barton and Edna Tan wrote this beautiful piece that I'm sure many of you have read, but it helps. I think it helps for us and the folks I was talking with in consultation to really think about whose knowledge are we centering in our professional learning? How are we participating in this larger project of rightfully presencing BIPOC community knowledge, expertise, advocacy work? In what ways are we trying to think about how we can use this knowledge to examine the system that we have too? So this is a lot on this slide, so I meant for it to come up in a few steps. But I think as I was working with some folks, I see both this original tension sort of between, are we designing professional learning or are we designing curriculum? And I think that's a big tension because, you know, as you start doing professional learning around things like rightful presence, you learn the curriculum's falling down. The curriculum isn't there. And so you end up doing curriculum development. So there's this reciprocal relationship between curriculum development and professional learning. So if you think you're doing one, you probably can end up doing both in some way. And there's a lot that's research that's out there that, you know, talks about educative curriculum, like Betsy Davis's work, and also this idea, even sort of some classic sort of tool theory work that says that, you know, when you involve teachers in the curriculum design, then it becomes a built by them, shared by them. You can develop a sort of shared thinking and learning, and really basing it in a shared set of like explicit visions of practice. So I think this is just a tension that I saw in talking with some folks. It's like, how do we balance these different pieces around designing for professional learning, designing for the adaptation of curriculum? And then we walked through, as we walked into this problem, we realized there's sort of these sets of other tensions that we're up against. So this idea that one that I think people are focused on is this idea of like teaching with fidelity to a particular curriculum. And we've started to think about that as like this idea of in what ways can we lean on critical race theory to help us understand how is this an extension of whiteness as property? This idea that that staying with the original script really is an assimilation move and not a move that helps with transformation. In one of our consultations, we thought pretty deeply about this idea of, is place-based teaching really the same as culturally responsive teaching? So when we're designing curriculum, in what ways are those different? And how do we attend to culture while we attend to place? So that was something that hopefully one of my friends will share also. And lastly, we were thinking about, as we design curriculum, how do we think about representing BIPOC communities, BIPOC knowledge in dignity confirming ways that isn't extractive, or tokenizing, like that. How do we really sort of show what it means to rightfully presence communities who are doing legitimate science that's often not been acknowledged as science for, we were thinking about science and math in particular. On the right-hand side, we were wrestling with, as you start thinking about designing professional learning, in one of our consultations, we were thinking deeply about what does it mean to interrogate the white gaze, Toni Morrison's idea, in professional learning. So how do we turn that mirror on ourselves, and both in our work with teachers, but also as the research group too? So how do we look deeply at that? Examine narratives that contribute to othering of cultures, question how the culture of white supremacy is showing up in the professional learning, the design, the content, the enactment of the PD. Those are all questions we're wrestling with, and as well as sort of wrestling with the role of extracting knowledge versus centering BIPOC expertise within our own research group. That's something that we're wrestling heavy with right now. So these are more sort of taking those design dilemmas that we were talking about last time. I sort of see it as a way of bringing them to, like, they look three-dimensional now. The second dilemma that I think we were really wrestling with, particularly with one group, was this idea of how do you engage with districts? So if you want to do intra-district working with a particular district, you have a choice of what Ruth talked about this a little bit. Do you want to work with teachers? Do you want to engage the district? There are benefits to working with districts because they have a lot of structures. There are also downsides to working with districts, in part because of the time that we're living in, where there's a lot of pushback around culturally responsive teaching or around critical race theory. And so part of what we talked about was, in those partnerships, being very real at the outset that says, we're going to accept that this idea of racial realism, that racism is permanent. It's a part of the work that we have. And it's a part of the way that we need to see the world and take this work both seriously and with be intentional about the work that we do. So drawing on what Dr. Morton shared with us at this recent AERA. I don't have solutions for how to walk through this tension, but I know many of you, and myself included, are walking through this tension. And so I'll just share a little bit about what we found. This idea of, you can engage with instructional, often we engage first with curriculum and instruction teams. And what we found is that working with those teams typically have a definition around equity as inclusion or access. That's very acceptable way of thinking with districts around equity. But what I talked about with this other group is this need to also perhaps reach out to other teams within districts, like the diversity and equity teams, because a lot of those folks are taking on the critical perspective that just hasn't been built into particular disciplines now. So building out those partnerships can be really robust. And then I think there's always this idea, it goes back to sort of the proof of concept, this idea of learning from below and then really showcasing the kind of knowledge and pushback that kids are showing, that then you can use once you have sort of this image of how kids are learning, how teachers are learning, then share it back with the district to help build capacity so it isn't around just some abstract notion of what practice might look like, but then having concrete like video examples too is pretty powerful. I'll pause there and invite other, I don't know, Kate or Amy. Do we have time for other folks to share too?
Yeah, we do.
Kate or Amy, I don't know if you have something you want to share too.
I don't really have much to share. I'm a real novice when it comes to designing learning for teachers. I've been designing learning for students, middle school students, especially for most of my career. So, I mean, what's interesting is that a lot of things we've talked about today are things that are very relevant when I think about my research with kids. And so, so I'm just sort of soaking up everything to think about my next step, which is a project with teachers that I'm trying to get going. So thank you, Jessica, and everyone. It's been very helpful.
I think I'll add that one of the things that we're facing is balancing the various pressures. So we're working with elementary teachers. And so from a project perspective or a research perspective, the idea of science sense making or ambitious and equitable science instruction, that's foundational to our project. It's not the innovation of the project, but to the teachers that we're working with, that's a huge innovation, you know, in addition to what Jessica is talking about, in addition to, so there's these teacher learning trajectories that we're thinking about how does teacher learning take place across multiple spaces, right? Across science sense making, across understanding of the sociocultural lives of students, across understanding of place. And I think it's something we continue to navigate. And I think also thinking about it, I forget who shared earlier, but this multi-year learning process, that it's not going to happen in 2 hours or 2 days or even 1 year or 2 years, which is the design of our study, but it's really across a longer, essentially research trajectory.
I really appreciate you all sharing your conversation. I mean, that was like very powerful for me to listen to because we are in a very contested time. And I really want to link together Jessica, actually a lot of these presentations, but Jessica's with Llamas in particular about how do, and actually Carrie's and Bruce and everybody's, but going back to Nico's question, how can we center teachers' affects and experiences, but at the same time, not center white fragility or white tears? Like that's, I mean, I can speaking from my own positionality as a Jewish white woman, like I feel like I have a different kind of obligation to midwife those experiences. And I'm very sensitive when I'm working with colleagues of color to try to take, like, this is mine, I got this, just because I feel like that emotional labor being asked of scholars of color or practitioners of color is something I try to unburden them from, from having to be on the front line of, because just like I was saying, I mean, some of the stuff that I deal with when I was talking about the emotional fallout of doing PD about status issues, some of it is about like, wow, I was always the best in math and that's always what's made me feel the best about myself. But some of it is also recognizing the extent to which this is a project of whiteness. And this is a way of consolidating white privilege in classrooms because of who has access to formal mathematics and, how ignoring mathematical intuitions that come from other perspectives, is a act of whiteness and a white supremacy. So there's that dimension too. I see Carrie wants to speak to Nico's question, so I'm gonna pass that on to Carrie.
Oh yeah, Nico, I really appreciated your question, and Jessica, I appreciated your presentation. I wanted us to also like really extend and think about when we use the royal we for researchers, to remember that there are researchers of color. So sometimes, and this happened at AERA too, like people were using, you know, feelings of discomfort talking about race, as if that happens to all researchers, you know, kind of forgetting that there are researchers of color also. And so, you know, which really relates to Nico's question, right? Like as researchers and PD providers of color, and Nico, I don't know if you want to unmute and kind of like share. I mean, this is something that I definitely grapple with, especially in teacher education work, right? Because a lot of my math ed students haven't learned about redlining. They don't know that standardized tests are tied to the eugenics movement. They don't know what the eugenics movement is, right? And so I end up teaching those things, but I do feel like sometimes I do end up centering, you know, those white emotions because that's the demographic of my candidates. So yeah, Nico, I don't know if you wanted to unmute and share thoughts. Oh, there you are. Hi.
Hello. I mean, it's just as I continue in thinking about these white institutional spaces that are constructed for erasure and assimilation, I'm just, you know, as I think about the PD that hopefully, you know, I will do in the future, I'm trying to think about that. You know, I am working still with a majority white population, but thinking about whiteness as this larger thing that kind of looms over education in general. So how do I maintain kind of pushing back, decentering it so that we can hopefully find some kind of way of thinking about the ways of being of the students who are being forced into these assimilative spaces, as they are facing their own napatla, their own tensions of being all the time, but then also not doing things for the comfort of white people either, or kind of caving into that comfort because those are the ones in power in the end. Even if I'm the PD person, whiteness looms over education, so I can't kind of forget that. And there is an effective component to all of that in terms of even the agency that I kind of work with, either share or within those spaces. So it was just a question that kind of brought up. It's not something that I've had the joy of experiencing yet, but just something I think about, especially within the spaces of teacher education also. And how do we push back, but also not center? And I can see this with a variety of other oppressive spaces, not just with these ideas of race, but the intersectionality with ableism and the interactions with cis heteronormativity. Like, so how do we decenter these things in pieces and continue to also not fall prey to the whiteness? And it's just what I've been thinking about with these conversations. So thank you all for that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Nico, and for the conversation that is making me really also think about so many things at this point. But I want to come back to this idea of teachers as sense makers, and if we center this idea, right? Like what does it mean to create spaces where we can sense make together, collectively bring everything to the table, but with the idea of kind of tearing it apart and seeing what we can learn from it and how we can make it better. So if we center this idea that teachers, whatever feelings they're bringing to the table, they are genuine and true to them, whether we agree with them, whether they are, coming from biases and problematic, harmful narratives pervasive in the society, right? Like if we don't make room for them to surface and make space for us to wrestle with them, I think then that can be also problematic because these will live under the surface and they will never be able to be used as resources for sense making. So how can we ease this tension around, even if ugly, like, I'm sorry, I'm using words like ugly or maybe difficult, negative emotions come up in these spaces, right? Like, how can we use them as tools that are telling us some things and dig into them instead of shying away from them? So even feelings where, like, white tears, right? Like, where are those coming from? Can we use opportunities where we can sit with those, surface them? What are they telling us, right? Where is the feeling coming from? And how can someone else in another skin, in another shoes, be experiencing something different with the same conversation? So like, put these emotions in conversation with each other. So to me, like, I feel like sitting with emotions as tools for sense making could be really useful. And that means also grappling with our own emotions in those spaces, right? And that's a lot of work that I do intentionally with around like having to pause and sit with, and sometimes I'm not ready and I say like, I'm not ready for this conversation and I want to come back to it, but maybe not today, and let's go. And I feel like sometimes just acknowledging the difficult emotions, but asking our emotion, being in conversation with our emotions about what are they telling us, and then what can we do with them? What are they serving and who are they serving? When I'm having this feeling of anxiety or vulnerability, who is it serving? Who is it oriented to? These are just things like prompts that I use with myself sometimes when I want to regulate my own emotion or think with my emotion, that I just wanted to share. But I don't think we have an easy answer around this big question that you asked, Nico.
Carrie? Carrie, did you want to add something?
Oh, I mean, I just think it's super complex because, like, I appreciate what Lonnie said about, like, white identified PD providers and scholars and educators, doing that emotional labor, because that's not, a space that I feel, I mean, I'm in that space because I'm in teacher ed in a predominantly white institution. But so I am in that violent and hostile space. But I think it also, like, it does feel a little bit disempowering to think like, okay, well, I need to ask a white colleague to come do this part of the PD because I don't want to be the one to experience the violence. So that's just what I'm kind of like grappling with right now. And then also, like, what do you do? Like, I have a Spencer project and like we're 3 women of color, right? And so it's like, it's something that we're just always gonna face, right? And so that's just a tension that I'm kind of thinking about right now.
I think we're getting to the end of our time, and I just want to thank everybody so much, all the participants, the panelists and the participants and the people who came to share their work with us and their ideas with us, the people who did the consultations and listened so carefully and deeply, people who are participating right now. I really feel like this is the richest conversation I've had about PD facilitation, and that was my selfish goal. Like, I always say, who would I want to have in this conversation? And I thought of the 4 of you, and I really feel like it's exceeded my hopes and dreams about, the kinds of things we've been able to surface. And I find this framing of tensions and dilemmas as really productive. And it's really clear from especially these issues that have come out at the end, but all through the consultations, that there is no checklist. There is no like right answer, that there is a lot of things we have to navigate and dance around. And, and I think that that's really real. And so I hope that for those of you who are entering this space, hoping to learn more about PD, we didn't scare you too much, but that maybe we've normalized some of the complexity of this work, so that you don't feel like, gosh, I must be doing this wrong because this seems really hard. No, it is really hard. If you're doing it right, it is really hard. So anyhow, I thank everybody again, and I'm really glad this is recorded because I am going to make all my students watch it. So if you were hearing me say this, students, you've watched to the end, so good job. I will ask you if you heard what I said at the end. Thank you to all the CADRE staff and co-PIs and so on who've helped facilitate all of this. And we will be posting this on the CADRE website and sharing it as a resource.